Mid-July 1945, 2 months after the end of the war in Europe and the Allied victory over the German Reich. The three Allied leaders have come to Germany to work out a peace treaty. 16 days of talks held at the Cecilienhof Palace in Potsdam go down in history as the Potsdam Conference. On Sunday, July the 15th, Harry S. Truman, President of the United States, reached Potsdam. On his way to meet Stalin and Churchill, he wrote to his mother, complaining he wasn't looking forward to the conference. He felt compromised by all the advice he'd been receiving as to how he should act. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was not much happier. Worried about his chances in the upcoming parliamentary elections back home, he complained he was very depressed and didn't really feel like doing anything. He wondered whether he'd ever get his strength back and planned to stay in the background at the conference. The third member of the coalition, Josef Stalin, arrived by train.
Почему Сталин прибыл на поезде? Кстати, на сутки позже. Он опоздал на одни сутки.
Why did Stalin come by train? And why 24 hours late? He did it deliberately because he was accustomed to having people wait for him. He just kept Mao Zedong's reception committee waiting a whole day. But he told Truman and Churchill it was he who'd been held up by the Chinese and left it at a formal apology.
Stalin suffered from fear of flying.
So a customized train was rapidly organized, an armored train, of course, specially fitted with bulletproof windows. Altogether, 8 of these trains ran between Berlin and Moscow, and around 15,000 soldiers were allocated to guard the tracks. That's 12 to 14 men for every kilometer.
Churchill and Truman found themselves in Potsdam with a day to spare. They spent their free afternoon touring Berlin to see the war damage for themselves.
That we are fighting for peace and for the welfare of mankind. We're not fighting for conquest. We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
Peace and welfare, not conquest. That was Truman's message. Truman's convertible and Churchill's jeep drove slowly through the city, past the ruins gleaming in the sun. Behind the Brandenburg Gate, the emblem of Berlin, was a larger-than-life portrait of Stalin. That told them who was boss here now. Churchill decided to visit Hitler's bombed-out chancellery, whose rubble had become a macabre attraction for souvenir hunters in the summer of 1945. Allied soldiers and local people crowded eagerly around the British Premier. Churchill refused to go down into Hitler's bunker. At the spot where Hitler's body had been cremated after his suicide, he turned away, overcome by disgust. The last shots had been fired in Berlin on May the 2nd. A week later, the German Reich had capitulated. The Berliners had started clearing away the rubble from their houses. Women's work, since most able-bodied men had been killed at the front or were invalids or prisoners of war. The perspective Truman gave the Germans was ironic, but at the same time positive. Truman wanted Germany to develop into an upstanding nation so it could take its place in the civilized world. Some of the less badly damaged districts in Berlin were already showing signs of revival. People were finding new hope, though no one could possibly imagine the economic miracle that was to come later. At first, there was sheer and utter misery, as Truman noticed during his tour of Berlin. He found the endless procession of old men, women, and children wandering around aimlessly, pushing or pulling their last remaining belongings, even more depressing than the bombed-out buildings. At that time, the railway in Berlin was running exclusively for the Russians. Berlin-Silieski, Schlesischer Bahnhof, was the terminus for the Moscow line, which had been converted to a broad-gauge track. Potsdam's derelict main railway station was the last stop for Stalin's special train on the journey to the Potsdam Conference. Driving in an armored car through Potsdam's inner city, Stalin saw a picture of destruction similar to what Churchill and Truman had seen in Berlin. Cecilienhof Palace, on the outskirts of Potsdam, was one of the few buildings that had survived the bombs and battles. Built in 1916, it was the last remaining palace of a European royal family, the Hohenzollerns. Their feudal coat of arms still stood proudly above the entrance. In the courtyard, a flowerbed in the form of a Soviet star greeted the dictator. Intact and secluded, the palace was an ideal meeting place for the Big Three, who had originally planned to convene in Berlin. The East Wing was reserved for Stalin and his entourage. The old music room of Prussian Crown Princess Cecily became the Russians' reception room, while her study and library were turned into Stalin's office. The palace's central living room was used as the conference chamber. Here, in 16 days, the fate of post-war Europe would be decided. The Russians had planned the conference down to the last detail. They allocated the west wing of the palace to the Western Allies. Right next to the conference hall was President Truman's study. Then came Churchill's suite. The palace terrace was a popular setting for photo calls and newsreel reports. The Big Three generally started their sessions after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Stalin and Churchill simply couldn't be persuaded to the conference table any earlier. At the very first meeting, Stalin proposed Truman as chairman. A tactical move? It certainly annoyed Truman, but he remained hopeful of achieving what he wanted. All three leaders pursued their own personal goals.
Stalin
was a conservative man. He wasn't dreaming like Adolf Hitler of dominating the world. He believed in world communism and global revolution, but he was cautious. We've got what we've got. We're quite happy to take what we can as long as it doesn't cost us anything. But we're not going to take any wild risks.
Truman felt that his first responsibility to his electorate was to end the war in the Far East.
Even before the conference began, he wrote home that he'd already achieved his main aim by obtaining Stalin's promise to join the war against Japan.
Truman was no man of the world, and his main aim was to get the boys home, a point that alarmed Churchill as he saw the American withdrawal from the continent would leave Europe exposed to the Soviet domination.
That was one of the British Prime Minister's major political concerns.
Churchill was playing the old British policy of trying to achieve a balance of power in Europe, a fact which was misconstrued by the Americans as being another facet of British imperialism.
Churchill put the European position eloquently, but he got little backup from Truman. Stalin didn't trust Churchill.
Он сказал, а Черчилль так. Это никогда не прошло.
This is what Stalin had to say about Churchill. Some politicians are only out to cheat their weaker partners in negotiations. That's how Churchill treated me. He invariably betrays anyone weaker than himself. You can see how suspicious Stalin must have been of Churchill, even though they were allies.
Большое недоверие к нему он испытывал.
Churchill was a lifetime enemy of communism, but he was prepared to ally himself with Stalin in order to fight the common cause in the war against Hitler. In August 1942, he actually flew to Moscow to meet Stalin and present him with the unwelcome news that there would be no Second Front that year. He described this as going to meet the ogre in his den.
Stalin spoilt his chances with Truman in Potsdam by demanding outrageously large war reparations.
Das hat Truman nicht gefallen und hat
Well, Truman didn't care for that.
Ich hab Stalin als ein son of a bitch.
And shortly after, he remarked that he thought Stalin was a son of a bitch.
Und mich auch.
That's pretty
Und
rough
ein
language.
Son of a bitch heißt so etwas zwischen Schweinehund und Hurensohn. Etwas obscene.
The three heads of state each had their own arrival ritual for the conference sessions in Cecilienhof Palace. The President of the United States was heralded by shrill sirens and surrounded by hordes of security men. The British vehicles were decidedly modest. Still, the Prime Minister staged an impressive entry through the main gates to the palace. Stalin, meanwhile, was driven up to the east side of the palace and entered his office on foot from the park. Some of the sessions started with photo calls and film cameras. Otherwise, the press was kept well away. All three delegations had their own stenographers. Historians would later discover that the three records differed in many respects. Truman took full advantage of being nominated chairman by Stalin. His carefully prepared agenda homed in on the knotty issues. Stalin didn't like the idea of a foreign ministers' council to prepare another peace conference later, and when Truman suggested a conciliatory approach toward Italy, it was Churchill's turn to get annoyed and unexpectedly side with Stalin. Interrupting the president, he protested angrily that it was the first time he'd ever seen the proposals and demanded more time to discuss them. Truman demanded the establishment of free democracies in Eastern Europe, but Stalin kept cool. He had his own notion of democracy and was quite sure of his control of the territories up to the river Elbe. Stalin also had his plans for dealing with the Allied Control Council for Germany, which had begun operating in June. Another tricky question for Truman as chairman was the matter of German reparations. US Finance Minister Henry Morgenthau had demanded the complete dismantling of German industry, but Truman didn't bring him to Potsdam at all. American banking experts had estimated that Germany could only afford to pay a maximum of $30 billion in compensation. Stalin reckoned $128 billion for the war damage in the USSR. Finally, it was agreed that each of the victorious allies could help himself from his own occupation zone. The Russians carried away as much as they could from East Germany. The division of the fleet was controversial too. Only a few ships were left from the German Navy. There was wrangling over the submarines, mainly because of their modern technical equipment. In the final months of the war, the German merchant navy in the Baltic had rescued 2 million refugees from the Russian army. Now, most of the ships were in the hands of the British. The Western Allies demanded every available German vessel for transport in the war against Japan. With the prospect of imminent victory in the Pacific, Stalin was eventually given a third of the German tonnage. Off-duty, the gentleman played friendly, just as here in front of Truman's residence, which he dubbed the Little White House. In front of the press, it was smiles all round. The Russians provided accommodation for themselves and their allies in the Potsdam suburb of Babelsberg, which had escaped the worst of the bombing. Russian soldiers and secret police officers controlled the streets. Red Army pioneers had constructed a pontoon bridge for access to the airport. Russian policewomen directed the traffic. The suspension bridge between Babelsberg and Potsdam had been destroyed. The original Glienicke Bridge was later reconstructed and became famous as the venue for spy exchanges between East and West. The residences of the three heads of state were reached over a narrow canal. Generalissimo Stalin had a particularly magnificent mansion.
Я был в том доме, где Сталин был.
I was staying in the same house as Stalin, a two-story building with 15 rooms at the shore of Griebnitz Lake. Every evening I saw Stalin sitting in an armchair looking out over the lake. He was probably searching for clues to the soul of these Germans he'd been forced to fight so bitterly.
Churchill's residence was further along the lake shore, in the middle of 50 villas that had been commandeered for the 260 members of the British delegation. Truman's little White House was at the edge of a compound housing 1,400 Americans. German residents had been forced out of the areas reserved for the Allies.
We lived in this street in 1945 and saw the barriers going up overnight. They built an ugly high wooden wall you couldn't see through. And suddenly we were told we couldn't go out in the street. We were only allowed to leave the house through the back garden.
The way the Allies treated each other in Potsdam gave a foretaste of future procedures at the borders between the Western and Soviet powers throughout Europe. Relations between the Russians and Western Allies were apparently cordial here, but at every barrier it was, "Passports, please." The checks were done courteously, efficiently and punctiliously, especially by the Soviets.
Die Russen waren sehr gefällig. Die waren sehr diskret und sehr höflich.
The Russians were very pleasant, extremely discreet and polite.
Belege, wenn nicht absolute Evidenz.
Still, even though I don't have conclusive proof, I'm pretty convinced that they planted bugs in the English and American apartments.
Wohnungen da gehabt.
So maybe that's why Stalin insisted on afternoon sessions only. It gave him time to get information about what Truman and Churchill discussed in the morning.
Stalin knew what his opponent and the other negotiating partner really wanted and what compromises they were prepared to make. So he won the lion's share of the agreements, negotiations, and decisions.
Der Agreements, die Verhandlungen und die Beschlüsse gewonnen.
Stalin was equally skilled at countering embarrassing political criticism. In September 1939 in Brest-Litovsk, a city in eastern Poland, the German army and the Red Army had celebrated the carving up of Poland. The two dictators had sealed Poland's fate with the Hitler-Stalin Pact. To defend Poland, Great Britain had then declared war on Germany. Now the British had to stand by and watch Poland being divided up for the 5th time. In Potsdam, Stalin stuck stubbornly to the predetermined borders. The former Hitler-Stalin policy was being pursued once again, and the British were extremely bitter about it.
Of particular concern to the British was what had happened in Poland, which was the country for whose independence Britain had gone to war in the first case. The suppression of the Polish Home Army in the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, the establishment of the Lublin government of Moscow-trained communists, the denunciation of the Polish ministers in London as fascists and traitors, the arrest by the Red Army of the 16 delegates that had been sent to Poland from London. All these things caused great concern amongst the British.
A map from the Allied conference at Yalta in the Crimea shows the variants of Poland's eastern borders which were up for debate in February 1945. Truman and Churchill simply regarded them as the basis for discussion of a future peace treaty and nothing more. But Stalin saw these frontiers as being final and broke off all talks about them. Churchill put the question, "What do we mean by Germany today?" Stalin answered, "Germany is what it was after the war, a country without a government or fixed frontiers." He ignored Truman's demand that they take Germany's pre-1937 borders as a starting point for negotiation. In January 1945, Russian troops penetrated the East German provinces of Silesia, East Prussia, and East Pomerania, while millions of Germans who lived there were fleeing westwards to safety. A great many died during this exodus and were terrorized by Red Army soldiers and the Polish militia. Those who hadn't fled yet were about to be driven out. By playing the right cards in Potsdam, Stalin achieved the shifting of the Soviet Union's western frontier by 250 kilometers. The inhabitants of eastern Poland were sent to the west in the wake of the Red Army and were resettled in eastern Germany. The Soviet Union also obtained the northern part of East Prussia. Poland was given control of southern East Prussia, East Pomerania, and the whole of Silesia. Millions of Germans left behind in these areas now faced expulsion. Stalin forced this crucial conference decision with the lie that all 9 million inhabitants of the East German territories had already fled. But Churchill quoted reports that 2.5 million Germans were still living in those areas. After all, there were transports westwards all the time. Stalin rejected his demand for Allied observers to monitor the resettlement. When Churchill attacked Stalin for dominating Eastern Europe and erecting an Iron Curtain, Stalin commented angrily, "You're making it up." By July the 25th, the time had come for Winston Churchill to leave Potsdam. The first elections in Britain since the war had swept the Labour Party to victory. Churchill had to step down as Prime Minister and give up his place at the conference table. At this point, the essential questions of the Potsdam Conference had been decided, or rather agreed upon. The bargaining about Poland and the reparations were now part of a major question that involved the division of Germany. However, this had not yet been dealt with openly. The original intention had been to leave the country intact. Before he left Potsdam, Churchill remarked to his daughter Mary that he would now return to indulging his artistic tendencies. Churchill had failed to achieve the main goal of his post-war policy, the balance of power in Europe. Now the atomic bomb was presenting global politics with completely different priorities. The day before Churchill's departure, Truman had informed Stalin about the US atomic bomb test. Stalin feigned disinterest. In fact, the nuclear arms race had begun. On the evening of July the 28th, the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee entered the conference chamber. There was only one topic left to negotiate, which would probably bring unanimous agreement: the punishment of war criminals. During the war, 2 million of the 5 million Russian prisoners of war had starved to death in prison camps. Another million had become refugees or had been shot by death squads. Jewish people from all the German-occupied countries in Europe had been brought to central camps like this one in Holland, and then transported to Nazi extermination camps in Eastern Europe. Packed into goods wagons, they were transported eastwards in endless trains. The Holocaust, organized by the SS to achieve what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, claimed the lives of 6 million Jews. In Potsdam, it was decided that the trials of war criminals should start within a few months of the end of the conference.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
On November the 14th, 1945, the US Chief Prosecutor, Robert Jackson, opened the tribunal in Nuremberg against German war criminals, the former masters of the Third Reich. The Soviet Union's representative, Roman Rudenko, whose leader had the death of millions of citizens on his conscience, accused the Nazis of state-controlled mass murder.
За организованные в государственных масштабах убийства миллионов.
The Potsdam Conference came to an end on August 2nd, 1945. Truman offered to host the next meeting in Washington.
Дай Бог и последний раз.
Stalin's comment was, "Let's hope it's the last time we'll see each other." Stalin wasn't really happy with the conference decisions, though he didn't say so in public. Of course, there were exceptions. The Polish question was resolved as he wanted. From then on, Poland and Yugoslavia were satellites of Stalin's Russia, and aside from Greece, the whole of the Balkans was now under his influence. He was quite satisfied with that.
The whole course of the conference had been set in the previous meetings, and nothing new was to be expected. Britain had exhausted and bankrupted itself in the 6 years of war that it had fought against Germany and Japan, and was now reduced to a third-rate power in the post-war world, now dominated by the two giants.
President Truman was in a rush to get back to the USA. It was on the return journey that he gave the order to drop the first atomic bomb on Japan. Years later, Potsdam's Cecilienhof Palace was turned into a memorial commemorating the conference and negotiations for peace after more than 5 years' bloodshed in Europe. Every year, around 400,000 visitors come to view the historic chambers and the conference table. The outcome was intended as a peace treaty for Europe, but it turned out to be the beginning of 45 years of Cold War.